Good morning. If sounds to me or looks to me like my voice can be heard, so I'm going to just continue. If there's any difficulty hearing me, please let me know through the question, by posting a question on the Q&A app. I'm going to share my screen now. All right, so again, good morning. And this is the committer orientation for projects running on an Eclipse Foundation service, either the Eclipse LocationTech or PolarSys Forge. I should apologize, I guess, in advance. I've been a little bit ill, so my voice is a little gravelly. I hope I'm coming across well. If not, there'll be a follow-up session and we can try again later. Anyway, let's continue. The Eclipse Development Process defines how Eclipse projects are supposed to operate. It's written in a very high level. It's not intended to describe how projects work on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't describe an agile process or anything to do with the day-to-day development activities of a developer, but it's more the framing around how the open source project itself will run. It includes, for example, the open source rules of engagement, which are I'll define in a few minutes. It defines the structure of how projects work, how we do governance of projects, and sort of a general framework for life cycle of projects, how committers are elected, the various roles within a project, those sorts of things. The open source rules of engagement are concerned with providing transparency, the idea being that somebody who is interested in the project has a chance to understand what the project is doing, and can get some insight into conversations that are happening around the project. This can take the form of when the project team gets together and has a meeting, they write their meeting minutes. The project team will use a public bug tracking system for all of the issues. One of the things for a project that's not operating well, one of the sure signs of that is that lots of fixes are happening, but there's no record of the discussion leading up to the decision to make that sorry, Google Hangouts talking to me here. This is okay. I think I've got this right, and I'm assuming someone will yell at me if I'm doing it wrong. Yeah, so all the code that goes into the project, there should be, at least for most of the code, there should be some public record of how it's the idea that got us to the point of having that code. A lot of open source organizations define open and transparent, kind of using the same language. We do things maybe a little different. We consider a project to be open if it is providing open opportunity. That is, if a project team is open to new ideas. If somebody shows up to a project with ideas and energy and code, they have the same opportunity to join the project as anybody else. Certainly, we don't tie this to employment. Very often, some of our most successful open source projects actually have developers that come from different companies. Very often, these companies have different, maybe these companies compete in the marketplace, but they work together in the open source project. Again, the idea is that it's open to all. Everybody who participates has the same rules. We refer to this as a level playing field. Meritocracy, the third rule of open source rule of engagement. The more that you contribute to a project, the more responsibility that you can earn. Ultimately, becoming a committer or perhaps a project lead, the path is usually through contribution. Somebody shows up to your project and they make a number of high quality contributions. A project committer will nominate them to this new person to themselves become a committer. Over time, somebody may start maybe showing leadership qualities. They may be elected to a project lead position. Same as the rest of the community, we also have a concept of an architecture council, which is our veterans, people who really understand our process. They becoming a member of our architecture council is also a path where people who demonstrate that they really understand what's going on in open source, they really understand what's going on in our projects and our process, can be nominated and elected into the and appointed to the architecture council. Vendor neutrality is another important aspect of working as an open source project at Eclipse. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we're open to all comers, including competitors, the notion of the level playing field. We offer vendor neutral services, including a project website, an issue tracker, mailing list and forum, an area for downloads, various services for hosting source code. These services provided by the Eclipse Foundation must be used by the project. We do actually offer GitHub as an option as well. We're able to do that because we have a freedom of action with GitHub. We have the ability to replicate the services, the data that is being hosted there, and are able to move it if we need to. So, for example, your Git repository, perhaps hosted on GitHub, we can rehost that on an Eclipse Foundation server should there be a need to do that. And the need may be motivated by a change in policy of the service provider or other sorts of things. The bottom line, though, of course, here is that projects that are operating with the Eclipse Foundation are required to use our services because we support those services and we can guarantee the longevity of those services. We can guarantee the policies which govern the use of those services. And again, the idea is vendor neutrality. We don't want any particular vendor or any particular individual to be able to dominate the project or take over the project. By us owning the infrastructure, that gives us the ability to take care of problems should they arise. If if an organization is trying to dominate the project, we have the ability to make changes to prevent that. Project teams serve three communities. The communities are, of course, the user community. Most of our projects produce something that is intended for users, although not all do. There is the adopter community. This is the individuals, groups, organizations that take the software produced by the project and incorporate it into their products or use it for their purposes. And then, of course, naturally, there are the developers, contributors, and committers. We expect project teams to respect these three communities, again, in as much as these exist for your project, and cater to them to some degree, court these communities. A large user community is a great way to build a large adopter community. A large adopter community is a great way to find new people to contribute and join your project as committers. By building these communities, by finding these communities where they exist and working with these communities, you grow the project, you increase the prospects of the project continuing to thrive into the future. Diversity is an important part of being successful in open source, and diversity takes multiple forms. Of course, we have the traditional forms of diversity, but in this context, I mean more multiple organizations or individuals from different backgrounds working on the project together. This helps a project survive a change in interests, for example, from a different organization. We have some projects, for example, that were sponsored by a single vendor that are no longer viable because that vendor has changed directions and business goals and has moved on from the project, leaving the project to stagnate. So again, we look for projects to have diversity goals and work towards those diversity goals. Writing code is fun, of course, and that's why we're here, and all Eclipse, LocationTech, and PolarSys projects are expected to write code. But this open source rules of engagement that I mentioned earlier are pretty important, very important. Projects are expected to operate in a transparent, open manner and use meritocracy to grow people. Actually, I guess one last comment on the meritocracy is you really do have to earn your way into a project. Every once in a while, it's actually fairly infrequent, someone comes to us and says, we hired somebody new to work on the project. That's wonderful. Get them to start contributing. Once they've contributed and have demonstrated a record of making high quality contributions, then they can be invited to become a committer. Again, the fact that they're employed by somebody makes no difference. Likewise, if someone leaves an organization, you can't just not make them a committer anymore. If somebody leaves the organization but still desires to be a committer on the project, we consider that to be completely valid and that they should continue. I've mentioned actually the other 2 points already. The last one is sort of an expression that's evolved over time, and some of our projects use it. Actually, I think it's sort of kind of an odd thing to say, I guess, but kill with kindness. The idea being is if somebody does show up to your project and they want to participate, be very kind to them. Help them understand how to contribute. Help them navigate the process of contributing. Help them to be successful. Overwhelm them is basically the notion here. Now, of course, realistically, if you overwhelm somebody, you may scare them a little bit. But the idea is, if somebody comes to your project, please do what you can to help them be successful with your project. This is how, in my experience, the most successful projects operate. And if you want your open source project to be successful, this is one of the best ways to do it, is make sure that when people show up, they are happy. And I wanted to say, almost said leave happy. We don't want them to leave. We want them to be happy, and we want them to stay with the project. One of the ways to make it so that people are successful with your project is to have a contribution guide. Contribution guide provides a way for somebody to understand how to interact with your project. And this can contain a lot of different kinds of information. I've listed a few things that are very basic here. How does somebody actually get at your code? How do they build your code? If somebody can't be successful getting your code and building it, it's going to be very hard for them to contribute. How does somebody raise an issue against your project? Having a pointer to the Bugzilla issue, or if you're using, currently we support projects using GitHub issues, having a pointer to that and telling people specifically what they need to do. Telling people, I'll talk a little bit about the CLA in a few minutes, that the contributors require a contributor license agreement. So all of this sort of information. And we look for this contribution guide in the root of your Git repos. So this would be a contributing.md file, perhaps, in the root of your Git repos, in a place where anybody who's cloned your repo from wherever your repo has been forked, they can easily find out how to get back to you and work directly with you on your project. Naturally, pointers to this information off of your project website are important as well, and anywhere else that makes sense. having great getting started documentation is an important thing to do if you really want people to participate in your project. Contributions received via Git need to take a certain form. The author information, the author specified in the Git commit record should contain the credentials of the person who actually made the commit. The header line, the first line in the message, if you prefix this with, I've got it in square braces, a bug number, or you write bug space bug number, and you're using our Garrett system, the Bugzilla instance will the corresponding Bugzilla record will automatically be updated with a pointer to this commit, which can be provides handy linkage and again greater transparency. For contributions received via Git, though, the author field needs to contain the credentials of the actual author. The author needs to have a CLA on record, and I'll talk a little about that in a minute. The CLA the email address for the CLA must match the email address in the author credentials. The author must also sign off by. The sign off by must be in the footer of the Git commit record. The email address must match the email address of the author. Multiple people can sign off, but at least one of the sign-offs must be the actual author of the Git commit. Now, why you might do multiple sign-offs is really project-specific. We really only require the one sign-off. So the idea is the author has signed our committer license agreement, which again I'll talk about in a minute. And by signing off, it's further acknowledgement that they understand the terms by which they are making this contribution. This is important for record keeping. Now, there's other things that you can put in the footer. If you're using Garrett, of course, there'll be a change ID. If there's a corresponding bug that this is fixing, having a pointer to the bug with a proper URL is a great thing to do to provide that connectivity between this commit. You can also provide one or more, or zero or more, I guess, also by entries. The also bys give you an opportunity to specify that this Git commit was actually authored by more than one individual, and our record keeping will keep track of that. We actually keep track of a log of intellectual property contributions, and this also by contributes to that. The Garrett and Git systems that we run for projects do some checks. Our Git instance and Garrett instance on the various Eclipse Foundation forges check for the CLA and sign off. If you attempt to push commits to Git, and one of those commits in your commit chain is from a non-committer, sorry, I guess back up. A committer can push whatever they want to their own project. A contributor, somebody who's not a committer on the project, if their commits are pushed to Git, and pushing to Git would be something that would have to be done by a committer. But if that committer is pushing contributions, the author of those contributions must have a CLA, and the sign off by field must be specified, as I stated earlier. If that's not true, the push will be rejected. Garrett will only accept a push from a contributor if the CLA exists and the commits are all signed off. So if you're having trouble, and in fact, when they are rejected, there is a fairly wordy message describing why they are rejected. And GitHub will warn you. If you get a pull request on a project that's hosted on GitHub, we've put in a hook into GitHub that will warn a committer attempting to accept a pull request if the CLA or signed off is missing. If that's true, we look to there's a responsibility of the committer to make sure that those things are taken care of before the pull is accepted. And one of the best ways to make sure that you don't have to do this too much is to make sure that it's very clear in your contribution guide that these things are required. If you're not sure if if a CLA is required or whatnot, engage with the IP team or with me or with your project mentors or your project lead, and they can help you understand if there's other requirements. So the committer license agreement is an agreement that must be signed only by people who are not committers on a project. With its current implementation, if you are not a committer on the project you are pushing to, you require a CLA. It's never wrong to have one. Not all committers actually need to have one, though. If you're only pushing commits to projects on which you are a committer, you really don't need one of these. But again, it's not wrong to have one. Contributors must digitally sign the CLA. It only takes a minute. By signing the CLA, the contributor is asserting that they have authored 100% of the content they are pushing. They are asserting they have the necessary rights to push that content and that they are providing the content under the licenses associated with the project they are pushing to. They are finally asserting that they acknowledge that their contributions are public, their name will be part of a public record, the email address that they use when they sign the CLA and push their commits will be accessible by somebody who clones that repository or otherwise gets the code. Contributors, again, as I stated earlier, must also sign off. So they sign the CLA goes into our records. We keep, our systems are updated to know that this exists. Contributors must then sign off. I've actually got the URL here at the bottom to go to the CLA. There's a link on that page to the signing of the CLA. And okay, so I'm just confirming that I have the Q&A option turned on. It appears that I do have the Q&A feature turned on, and I'm not seeing any questions. So I'm going to just continue. Projects undergo or have a life cycle at Eclipse. We start off with a declaration, follow that up with a proposal. The declaration is really you talk to somebody at the Eclipse Foundation and say, hey, I want to propose a new project. We provide pointers and some information to that individual, and they create a proposal. We assist with the proposal creating process. We have certain things we look for, which I think are a little out of scope with this discussion today. Projects go through a proposal phase. During proposal phase, we secure the trademark for the project name. We find mentors for the project. We help the project team. The project team may take feedback from the community and modify their proposal a little bit. Maybe the scope might change. Maybe they may add new committers or whatnot to the proposal. Once a project has gone through a proposal for about 2 weeks, we put it into incubation. I say a minimum. I said 2 weeks as a minimum. Sometimes we've had, sometimes depending on who we wait for, so this takes a little bit longer. Trademarks tend to be things that get bogged down in legal departments. Sometimes project teams just disappear on us. Sometimes, anyway, there's lots of other things. But 2 weeks is sort of the minimum that we aim for. The mean is probably closer to about 3 or 4 weeks because of all of the activities that need to be undertaken. Once we're confident in the proposal content, confident that the community is ready for the project, confident that we have are able to reasonably assert ownership of the name of the new project trademark, we engage in a creation review, which puts a project into the incubation phase. A project in the incubation phase can do multiple releases. We do release reviews for each of these. I'll talk a little bit more about releases and reviews in a minute. The project can do as many releases as they would like in incubation. How long a project stays in incubation really depends on the project. One of the key benefits of incubation is there is a slightly relaxed process for intellectual property review. A project can engage in what we call the parallel IP process while in incubation. This allows a project contribution to undergo a cursory review before the project can start to use it. A review of the intellectual property would then occur. A full review would occur in parallel. Again, a project in incubation, you take advantage of this. The downside, of course, is the project in incubation must label themselves as being in incubation. And that takes the form of a little incubation egg on the project page. It takes the form of certain wording that needs to frame the downloads of the project. The downloads themselves, zip files that contain your code need to actually have the word incubation in them. I will provide some pointers at the end of this document to some of the incubation branding requirements. Traditionally, projects in incubation do pre 1.0 releases, but there's actually no requirement to do that. If it makes the more sense to do it, we want you to do what makes the most sense for your community. Projects that move to Eclipse, LocationTech, or PolarSys may have existing releases, and so if you came here with a 3.0 release, maybe the next natural thing to do is a 3.1 release, and we encourage you to do that. The reason why I bring that up is there are enough people who have been in our community long enough that they remember the old rule that says you can't do that. So just keep that in mind. Incubation ends with a graduation review. Very often we couple a graduation review with a release review. And I say very often, meaning I can't remember the last time we didn't do that. So, say, hey, we're going to do our 1.0 release or our 7.0 release, and at this one, we're going to graduate. And the graduation puts the project into a mature phase, which is a sign to the community that this project's APIs are stable, that the project team understands the development process, that the project is basically something that you can confidently incorporate into your products or use. At any point during incubation or mature, if it's determined that the project is no longer viable for whatever reason, we can engage in a termination review and put the project into the archived stage. The project can be revived from archived through another proposal. We've recently did this actually with the PMF project, and that's something that's been revitalized and moving ahead again. The terminations, actually, we do a handful of terminations every year. We do fewer terminations than creations. But it's sort of a natural part that some projects go away. In some cases, we've had projects merge into others, and there's sort of a termination involved with that. One project ceases to exist and another one just gets some code. Some projects just run their course. Some turn out to be bad ideas. Some are research projects that have run their course and there's no more interest, or they've discovered what they needed to discover and the project wraps up. And of course, there's many other things that can happen. Project leadership. Projects have project leads designated. Project leads have responsibility to do general management. They maintain project metadata. They make sure that the goals or the obligations of the Eclipse development process are met. And they provide technical leadership. The obligations are, with regard to the development process, are actually relatively small, but project lead takes the initial responsibility for making sure that project teams understand and are following the process. They are the primary liaison between the PMC, the Project Management Committee, which I'll talk about in a second, and the Eclipse Management Organization, EMO. I am the point person basically for the EMO. If you have questions, I take them. The EMO basically has overall responsibility for projects and the Eclipse development process itself. The EMO is actually composed of the entire Eclipse Foundation staff, as well as our Architecture and Planning Council. They, again, collectively, you're responsible for making sure that things go. The Eclipse Foundation staff keeps our servers running. I maintain the process. We have an IP team that does intellectual property work. We have various business development assets. We have some marketing assets. There's all sorts of things that we do to keep the Eclipse community moving along. The project management committee sits somewhere in the middle of this. They provide technical approval of intellectual property contributions. They provide approval for releases. This takes the form of the when you do a release and there's a corresponding review, you ask the PMC to review your materials and make sure that you have proper documentation, and that implicitly includes a approval from the PMC to do your release. So the PMC has overall responsibility, overall oversight into the projects that fall into their domain. All of our projects are fall underneath a top-level project, and each of these top-level projects has a distinct PMC. Each PMC provides a charter for their top-level project, and projects are, in addition to conforming to the Eclipse Development Process, projects are expected to conform to any constraints or obligations defined in the top-level project charter. Excuse me. For releases, projects should be following a fairly lightweight process of capturing some kind of plan, doing some sort of implementation, producing milestone builds, iteratively implementing more, producing milestone builds throughout a release cycle, and then ultimately doing a release before starting the whole process again. Capturing a plan takes a couple of different forms. What we like project teams to do is at the beginning of a release cycle, have some sort of idea what kinds of things they're going to do. And frankly, the ideas can be, and this is certainly true for projects that are relatively new, the theme can be, we're just going to fix bugs. We've got a whole bunch of, this last release was great, but this next release is just going to be going through the bugs. Or maybe you might say, hey, the theme, we're going to replace the user interface. We're going to augment, we're going to provide some new APIs, provide some great new functionality. I think it's pretty normal that a project team for a project that is active to have some idea what they're doing. And with a project plan, all we're really asking you to do is document that so that others have a fighting chance of understanding what your plans are. So this can take all sorts of different forms, how it's documented. Minimally, having a bunch of bugs open in or issues open in your issue tracking system is the sort of the minimal thing that you can do to capture a plan. Having dates beside those or version numbers beside some of those issues, when are you going to be addressing a particular issue? That can be a minimal plan. We actually have a system, we call it the PMI, which I'll talk briefly about in a minute, that allows you to capture information about your releases. My strong preference is that a project team at the beginning of their release cycle create a release record in the PMI for their project that describes in very concise terms, a couple of sentences, what your plan is. So have a description on your release and a date, a target date. Again, if somebody shows up to your project, they have a fighting chance of understanding what you're doing. With that plan captured, you can change it over the life cycle. But as you're changing your plan, it needs to be communicated to your community. One of the ways to do that is through your project's dev list or through project forums or whatever communication channels your project uses. You should be, certainly newer projects, this is a little bit harder to do, but as the project starts to get more stable, you should have a repeatable automatic build that's producing milestones throughout your development cycle. Seriously mature projects do integration builds, they do nightly builds, they may have use continuous integration builds using a Hudson or similar service. Milestones are a way for the community to grab your code and use it and provide feedback for your next release. Now, that's certainly very valuable if your release plans are fairly long term. Projects that participate in the simultaneous release, for example, Many of them release only once a year. And in that case, having many milestone builds is very important. Um, if your project decides that they're going to do releases much more frequently, you may decide to do fewer milestones. The eGit project, for example, did 6-week release periods for a little while. As they've grown more stable, the need to do that frequent a release has diminished. But for a while, they were doing 6-week releases, and I'm actually not sure if they were doing milestone builds during that 6 weeks. I think they were just doing nightly builds. But by releasing on that at that level of frequency, they were able to get feedback, get code to their community and feedback from their community, and then repeat their cycle very quickly. And again, everybody benefited from that. So the release review, for every release, we require a review. Sorry, let me restate. For major and minor releases, we require a release review. A release review is a formal process of assembling documentation and confirming and validating the intellectual property log for your project. Plan to spend time, about 30 minutes or so, documenting your release. Planning probably takes longer than that, but documenting your planning certainly shouldn't take too long. For service and bug fix releases, no review is required. No IP log review is required. So if you're shipping a 5.2.3 release, just push out your bits, tell your community about it, and everybody's happy. But for, excuse me, for major and minor releases, we require a release review. Now this looks a little scarier than it is. The PMI that I mentioned earlier has a means of specifying a release document, records. These release records have several fields which can be used to provide release documentation. Assemble that release documentation, and what I look for minimally is a description. We actually and maybe pointers to issues that have been addressed. We have a means of automatically pointing to issues that are represented in our Bugzilla instance for you. But there's a few fields in there. If you've changed major changes to APIs, should be captured. If there are specific issues with security, those need to be captured. One of the things I do look for is evidence of community development with releases. So the release review needs to be, the documentation needs to be assembled and forwarded to the PMC via their mailing list. In parallel, the IP log needs to be assembled. Now, we actually do this for you. If you keep track of author information on your commits using the standard method, your IP log can be generated completely automatically. The IP log assembles information from all sorts of different locations, and I'm not going to, this will be a little out of context, a little out of scope for today. But we have a tool that generates the IP log for you. You need to review it to make sure that there's no errors in it, and then forward that to the IP team for their review. With the PMC's approval of review documentation and the IP team's approval of the IP log, we can start the release review, which must run according to the development process for 1 week. I usually talk about review schedules in terms of the end date. So our next review date is February 17th. February 17th is the end of the review. On February 17th, I will declare victory for those reviews. But all of the information for those reviews is actually due today, a week in advance. Now, I say 2 weeks in advance. We have a little bit of room for a little bit of wiggle room, but getting this in early is your best guarantee of being able to release on the date that you choose. Now, we run these reviews. We end these reviews twice a month, on the first Wednesday and the third Wednesday. So try to account for that in your planning. If there is a desperate need, we can throw in an extra review period, but they typically almost always end on Wednesdays. And again, I do 2 a month I would consider it, we consider it an exception to do otherwise. I've got a question. I've heard that releases must be built via the Eclipse build infrastructure. Is this correct? Actually, no. The build infrastructure that we provide is considered a service that we think is valuable, but if it makes sense to build using different infrastructure, that's perfectly acceptable. We have some examples of projects that are just builds, for example, that are just far more complicated than we're able to provide services for. Maybe they connect to services we don't provide. So the answer to the question is, I've heard that releases must be built via the Eclipse build infrastructure is not true. It is true, however, that you should make your projects buildable, right? So somebody should be able to get your code and actually build it on their own infrastructure. And if that build is complicated, you need to provide the description, right? You need to make it so that people can actually build your stuff. I hope that answers the question. The intellectual property due diligence process, which I'm only going to sort of touch the surface on today. The important takeaway is that you need to engage in this as an Eclipse project team member. There's a link here to the due diligence process described in a poster form. It's a flowchart. Pick your starting point based on what you're trying to do, and follow the chart. Basically, though, if you are a committer on a project and you are working on the project, you can commit your code. There is a term in the poster called that refers to some work being done under supervision of the PMC. Something is said to be under the supervision of the PMC if the PMC and the community could reasonably know that you are doing it. So if it's sort of part of the natural work being done on the project, you sat down today and the project exists and you just started working on a feature, that's under supervision of the PMC. If there's a bug in the bug tracking system an issue in the issue tracking system that covers the feature that you're working on, then that's under the supervision of the PMC. If you've been discussing it in a mailing list or in a news group or something, that's also under supervision. If you worked on it 4 years ago in an unrelated thing, and it's a bunch of code that you think is useful to bring to your project, that wasn't done under the supervision of the PMC. I'm hoping that those examples may cover it. If you go away for a couple of weeks and don't talk to anybody and then come back with a bunch of code, that's sort of gray area. If somebody could reasonably, again, if there's an issue open for it, if there's been discussion about the feature and you just happen to go away and implement it without talking to anybody, that's probably under the supervision of the PMC. If you're not sure, ask your PMC. If you're not sure, ask. There's actually an incubation mailing list that I'll talk about briefly in a minute. Ask on the incubation mailing list. There's lots of people who've been through this and can help you make a call. If something has not been done under the supervision of the PMC, or maybe you've taken a contribution from a third party, there may be some activities that you need to do. If you take a contribution from someone who's not a committer, and it's more than 1,000 lines of code, or you think maybe there might be some code in there that might have been copied, or that the contributor might not have actually authored themselves, if you're not sure, you would need to engage with the IP team, and we do this through what we call contribution questionnaires. These contribution questionnaires are entered into a system that we it's a modified Bugzilla instance, basically, and the IP team then will take that contribution through our process. It's also the case where if you have third-party libraries that you're using in your project, these also need to be vetted by the IP team. Now, the IP team has vetted literally thousands of libraries already, so chances are very good that a library that you're using has already been seen by the team. And in that case, that kind of the review of that, approval of the use of that, will go fairly quickly. If the IP team hasn't seen a particular library or a particular version of a library, they may take a little while to get that. It may take a little while to get that approval. So just be prepared for that. So all third-party libraries, and this is the just to be clear, this is the transitive closure. If you're using a third-party library that itself uses libraries, and those libraries use libraries, and one of those libraries uses libraries, all of that needs to be approved by the IP team one way or another. So be prepared for that. Also be prepared that approval of the use of third-party libraries is on a per version basis. So if you're using an old version, one version, and then in a new release, you're using a new version, you will have to take that new version to the IP team for their approval. Be aware of builds that do this by accident. We actually do have a process where I will review your project downloads to make sure things haven't snuck in by accident. And that's usually the case. Very often, again, the build is the culprit. Your build may be flexible in terms of what version of the library it pulls in, and it just pulls in an older one. So again, try to be aware of that. So when the project, what the IP team looks for is they actually will go through the for third-party libraries for contributions. They actually go through the code. They look for evidence that the code has known pedigree. We need to know who actually authored it. We need to know who owns the code. We need to know that the code is the people that have authored, the people that have authored the code and have ownership of the code are indeed the people making the claims. We need to make sure that the license for the third-party libraries is compatible with the project code. And very often the IP team, or intellectual property due diligence team, will actually go and communicate with the authors of these third-party libraries to get confidence that that the proper that the code has been properly I want to say recorded. What's the word? Tracked. The contributions have been properly tracked to the project, and that the pedigree of all the code is known. Some important IP terms. The initial contribution is all projects that start will start by providing a initial their initial code base as the first thing that the project gets, the first contribution to the project. This the IP team will review that and give approval. This is kind of just partly it's a means of meeting the IP team and getting used to the process. But the big part of it is a lot of these initial code bases are very large, and we need to make sure that the contribution being, and actually size really doesn't much matter, but we need to make sure that the code being contributed to the project is again legally being contributed, that the authors are indeed the authors, and that every once in a while the IP team finds bits of code that maybe have questionable for various reasons. I shouldn't give too many examples here. This is certainly not an area of my expertise, which is why we have an entire team that's dedicated to doing this. The way that you engage with the IP team is through a contribution questionnaire, and I'll show you how to do that in a demo at the end of this. The piggyback CQ is a contribution questionnaire to use a library that's previously been approved. This is just a way of annotating that we already have seen this library, and that approval should go fairly quickly. IPzilla is what we call our IP tracking system. As I mentioned earlier, it's a modified version of Bugzilla. Parallel IP is something that incubating projects get to use. Parallel IP is, as I mentioned earlier, when you make a contribution, when you want to use a third-party library in your project, if you are eligible for parallel IP, then the IP team does a cursory review of your code, of your contribution, of your third-party library. and gives you intermediate approval to use it. So you can incorporate it into your code base and start doing builds based on it, that kind of neat stuff. And in parallel, they bring the full weight of the due diligence process onto it. And then sometime later, they will come back and say, okay, you're good to go. That just means that you can get started and moving more quickly. Now, as I mentioned, projects are eligible for parallel IP if they are in incubation. It's also the case that there is a parallel IP for new versions of previously approved libraries. For mature projects can take advantage of that. Our IT team provides a number of different services. We have, of course, Git repositories on our servers, builds, downloads. Every once in a while, some permissions get out of whack. If you need to communicate, if you have problems, communicate with the webmaster directly, webmaster@eclipse.org, or even better, open up a bug against the Bugzilla instance. Probably should have provided a URL. I'll do that on the record here. There, the entry that goes into YouTube. So the webmaster provides all of this infrastructure, mailing lists, forums. The webmaster team is actually responsible for a lot of our website content. Certainly the structure of the website, the functioning of the website. The webmaster manages our presence on GitHub. They are responsible for creating GitHub repositories and making sure the hooks are installed and all that neat stuff. If you have trouble that's related to the IT services, communicate directly with the webmaster team. Check for questions. No questions. Moving on. One of your best sources of information is the project handbook. It's sort of the all-in-one guide. I call it the all-in-one guide. It's actually a living document. We continue to improve this document. It's actually part of a project we call Dash, which is stuff for committers. Dash project has a handful of bugs open against the handbook to add new features, add new content to it. One of my greater, I'm going to call it a failing with the handbook, is it wound up being very big. I'm a big fan of concise documentation. However, we wound up, we get a lot of questions and we wanted to cover off all the questions. So there's a lot of information here. I recommend that you treat it as a reference as opposed to something that you should read back to front. There's the section there on starting a new project. If you're in that state right now, there's a good section on how release reviews work. There's some overview of the intellectual property process. We have variations of this handbook for PolarSys and LocationTech as well. The URLs I'm specifying here are temporary. We're going to find homes on the corresponding forges for this as well. So anyway, the handbook is a great resource for this, and I would usually, when people ask me questions, I provide a link to the handbook. If the handbook doesn't provide an answer to the question, I open up a bug to solve that problem, and that's how. Again, the handbook is what is the go-to resource. The incubation mailing list is something new that we've created that pardon me, that we've only just had this for the last month or so, but we have great hope that this is going to be an awesome resource. We are starting just now. For all new projects, project team members will automatically be subscribed to this list. It's possible to subscribe manually if you want, and of course you can unsubscribe from it, but I would recommend against unsubscribing while you're in incubation. We are asking new projects to announce themselves on this list. Again, this is all new stuff. With new things that we're doing. New projects will start announcing themselves on this incubation list, and all questions posed to this is where you ask the questions. The reason why you would ask here is this has got, in addition to projects and project team members who are in incubating projects, we have the Architecture Council subscribed to this. The Architecture Council are the veterans of the Eclipse development process. They're the ones that understand how things are done, and they are the best people to answer your questions. And of course, I'm going to be there, and I will be answering questions too. But this is the best way to go, place to go to ask questions. And of course, being a part of this mailing list means that you would be privy to the discussions as they are happening, and maybe have a better chance of finding out what you don't think you need to, or don't know that you need to know. So we think this is a great resource for incubating projects, and we invite you to participate in it. So please do. Project metadata, we ask project teams, and this is primarily responsible of the project lead, but any project committer can maintain it. The project metadata drives various processes. The IP log generator, for example, knows which Git logs to get information, or Git repositories to get information from based on the repository information provided here. I use the description information a lot. If I send out information about your project to somebody, having a concise elevator pitch description of your project is very handy. It helps me help you. Also, I'm of the mind that if you can't describe your project to somebody in 15 seconds, you're in big trouble. So I look for a description of the project. I also look for an elevator pitch description on release records. If you can't describe your release to somebody at a high level in about 15 seconds, we may have some trouble. Again, the answer may be, hey, we're fixing bugs. That might be the elevator pitch. But project metadata lets you track source code, your builds, where your issues are, releases, relationships with other projects, what build technology you have and use, and all that sort of thing. And it looks a little bit like this. This is the a picture of the PMI main page for the BuildShip project. This is actually how it appears to me. For regular people coming to your project, they'll see overview, downloads, who's involved, developer resources, governance, and contact us. You see edit. If you are a committer, you can click edit and edit information about your project. I see devel. I probably should get a screenshot that's more like what you would see. Over on the right side, you see there's a committer tools box. This actually is minimized by default. If you click on it and open it, you get access to a handful of different tools that you can use. Get access to your IP log, create contribution questionnaires for third-party libraries, links to just send email to your PMC, and whatnot. It's important to keep your project information up to date. Again, this is what we use to communicate information about your project to the community. This is the consistent way that the community members can come and find out information about projects in general. So making this as easy to digest as possible and up to date is extremely important. And again, make sure you have that contribution guide. So I didn't actually talk about a bunch of things. Before I wrap up, I've actually got some just links at the end of this presentation, which I'll make a PDF of this presentation available as well, and I'll provide those links. I just want to do a quickly show you what the PMI looks like. And I should probably share a different screen. Projects.org. In the future, I'll actually have this. Next time I run this, I'll actually have this running. Poor plan. Anyway, so this is the project pay information page for the eGit project. Here's what you see if you are a regular person coming in, not logged in. Of course, you can log in and When you log in, you get a few more bits of information. Again, committer tools here is down the side. Take a look at this. There's some different features here to do things that are project related. We also have at the top of the page, you can go and find out information about your Eclipse account if you need to change email addresses or that sort of thing. The information here, again, click edit, allows you to edit the information. If you need to do a new release, create a new release, and that will open up, give you the ability to look at release information rather than create one on the poor eGit project. I'll just take a look and see what we've got here. So inside a release record, we have the ability to specify a description, which they haven't done yet. They're still a little bit early in their release schedule, but we have information, ability to specify different kinds of information, and you'll notice that most of these are listed as optional. So different things, just different aspects of the project. And again, we ask that you provide minimally, though, the date and the description of your release. Anyway, that's the full hour, so I'm going to wrap up. I see that there are no questions. If there are questions, of course, please do use the incubation mailing list. If you're not sure about the incubation mailing list, or maybe you've forgotten about it, try to remember emo@eclipse.org. That's kind of that gets directly to me. The incubation mailing list scales better than I do, but I can certainly be happy to help you answer any questions that you have. So again, if you have questions, please do pose them using those resources. I hope that this was valuable, and I do thank you for your attention, and everybody have a good day.